The night Kimberly Dawson disappeared was supposed to be ordinary, the kind of night everyone forgets by morning. She was coming home from her late shift at the diner on Belmont Street, her white sneakers tapping softly against the cold pavement, her breath forming thin clouds under the streetlights. She was tired, but hopeful. Kimberly always carried hope like other people carried keys, close, essential, something she refused to let go of. Her coworkers said she laughed on her way out the door. Her mother said she left a pot on the stove waiting for her. Her sister said she was supposed to braid her hair before bed. But the space between "she's almost home" and "she's gone" was only a few minutes long, and it ruined an entire family. Kimberly always called home after her shift. It was her rule, by her promise, even on nights when she was exhausted. So when the phone stayed silent, her mother tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe Kimberly stopped for a snack. Maybe she bumped into a friend. Maybe she forgot. But mothers know the difference between being late and being in danger. By 12:07 a.m., fear settled in like a weight on her chest. By 12:30, her mother was standing on the porch, dialing her daughter's number again and again, praying for a ring that never came. When she finally grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the street felt wrong, too quiet, too hollow, too empty. And 5 blocks away, under the dim glow of a flickering lamp, a single object waited to be found. Kimberly's purse, open, contents scattered, the strap torn. Not dropped, not misplaced, taken. By 1:00 a.m., the Carter home was no longer a home. It was a command center built out of fear. Lights on, doors open, voices shaking, neighbors rushing over in slippers and coats, asking questions no one had answers to. Search parties formed in minutes, spreading across Winchester like a storm, flashlights cutting through the cold November air. Every second felt like something was slipping further away. A neighbor found tire marks near the spot where Kimberly's purse had been discovered. Deep grooves in the dirt, like a rush to escape. Someone else swore they heard a scream earlier, but convinced themselves it was just the wind. Another said they saw a dark car speeding away, but couldn't remember the plate number. Everyone had a memory that mattered, and none of them mattered enough. By sunrise, the fear had spread from one family to an entire town. Parents held their kids a little tighter. Doors were locked earlier. Trust cracked in places people didn't expect. Because if Kimberly wasn't safe walking a road, she'd walked her entire life. Who was? The police arrived just before dawn, their radios hissing through the quiet street. Officers asked the same questions over and over. When did you last see her? Did she say anything unusual? Has this ever happened before? Every answer felt like a punch to the gut because none of them brought Kimberly any closer. Her mother's hands shook so hard she could barely hold her coffee cup. She kept whispering, "She should have been home. She should have been home," like she was trying to convince time to rewind. Her father paced the yard until the grass was crushed flat, refusing to sit, refusing to blink, refusing to accept the reality tightening around him. By mid-morning, officers found Kimberly's school notebook at the edge of the trail, pages bent, cover smeared with dirt, as if it had been dropped during a struggle. A torn bracelet lay a few feet away. Small things, quiet things, but to her parents they were the loudest signs of terror imaginable. The first 24 hours ended with more questions than answers, the kind of questions that turn a family's whole world into a wound. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Kimberly didn't just go missing. Something took her. By sunset, the Carter home felt nothing like the place Kimberly grew up in. The kitchen table, once covered with school projects, birthday cakes, and messy art supplies, was now buried under maps, phone lists, and half-drained cups of cold coffee. Neighbors came and went with flashlights and tense faces. Some stayed to help. Others stood quietly, afraid to speak the fear everyone shared. Kimberly's mother stared out the window like she was waiting for her daughter to step into the porch light at any moment. Every set of footsteps on the sidewalk made her flinch. Every shadow made her breathe faster. Her father tried to stay strong, but the moment the officer stepped outside, he crumpled into a chair and covered his face. You could hear the pain in the way he breathed. Slow, broken, fighting not to fall apart. Police expanded the search past the trail. Dogs sniffed through brush. Volunteers scoured back roads. Officers shouted her name until their voices cracked. But midnight came again, and still, nothing. It was the silence that finally broke her mother's heart. Not the fear, not the missing notebook, not the empty street, the silence. Because silence meant she wasn't coming home on her own. And when the porch light flicked on, the same one Kimberly grew up under, the same one that welcomed her home after every school event, every trip with friends, her mother whispered, "Please, follow the light." That October night didn't just take Kimberly, it broke something inside her family that would never fully heal again. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The morning after Kimberly vanished, the police station felt colder than the October air outside. Officers spoke in clipped tones, flipping through notepads while avoiding the parents' eyes. Everyone knew the first day mattered most, yet nothing about the search felt sharp or focused. It felt scattered, rushed, messy, uncertain. Two patrol cars rolled through the walking trail where her tote bag had been found. They checked the bushes with flashlights, kicked through leaves, and marked the ground with small cones. But cones didn't comfort a mother whose child hadn't slept in her own bed. Kimberly's parents stood behind the police tape shivering, not from temperature but from fear that tightened around their ribs like a vice. An officer finally approached them with a voice too calm for the situation. "We're doing everything we can," he said, the kind of line families hear when the truth is the opposite. Her mother couldn't even nod. She just kept staring down the trail, whispering her daughter's name under her breath as if it could pull her back. Her father stepped closer to the officer. "Check farther. Don't just stay here," he demanded. She would have fought. She wouldn't just disappear. But the response was another rehearsed line. "We have to follow protocol." Their daughter was missing, and all they heard were rules. Inside the station, detectives argued over the timeline, whether she left at 6:10 or 6:15, whether the call she missed happened at 6:40 or 6:50. Minutes mattered, but somehow even the minutes were uncertain. Witnesses contradicted each other, reports overlapped, notes were incomplete. Kimberly's name was being spoken in a dozen rooms, yet no one seemed to truly understand the urgency. That was the first crack in the investigation. Not a lack of evidence, but a lack of fire. And once that crack formed, everything else began to stretch around it. By midday, the investigation was already slipping through the gaps. Witness statements poured in, but none matched, none aligned, and none held steady long enough to build a path forward. One woman insisted she saw Kimberly walking with a tall man in a brown jacket. A teenage boy swore she was alone, hurrying toward the bus stop. A store clerk claimed she came inside to buy a bottle of water, but surveillance footage later showed no trace of her. Every answer created a new question. Every detail created a new contradiction. The detectives tried to push through the noise, but the noise was louder than the truth. Reports overlapped. Timelines collapsed into each other. Officers sent to verify alibis returned with different descriptions of the same person. It was as though the entire neighborhood remembered the wrong version of the same night. A blue car. No. A gray truck. No. A bicycle. No, nothing at all. The confusion made her parents sick with panic. Kimberly's mother pressed her palms together and begged, "Please, just find the truth. I don't care who's right, just find her." But confusion is a slow poison. It wears down urgency. It buries momentum. And the more the police tried to sort it out, the more the trail blurred into static. Detective Harris slammed a folder shut in frustration. "This case is turning into smoke," he muttered. Not because of lack of effort, but because the facts refused to stay still. Outside, neighbors gathered in small circles, trading theories like gossip, adding more noise to an already tangled mess. The search party meant to bring clarity only added more contradictions. Someone claimed they found a fresh footprint. Another said it belonged to a rescue worker. Someone thought they heard a scream. Someone else insisted it was just a dog. Truth doesn't stand a chance when chaos becomes the loudest voice in the room. And by the end of that night, the case wasn't clearer. It was drowning. Drowning in guesses, drowning in contradictions, drowning in everything except answers. The next 48 hours became a storm of names, theories, and desperate attempts to anchor the investigation to something solid. Detectives needed direction, any direction. And that urgency pushed three potential suspects into the spotlight far too quickly. The first was a coworker, a young man who walked the same route as Kimberly after closing shifts. He was quiet, awkward, and kept mostly to himself. That was enough for the rumor mill to crown him as odd and enough for police to question him for hours. He broke down twice during the interview, not out of guilt, but out of fear. By sunrise, his alibi checked out perfectly. The second was a neighbor, someone who often waved at Kimberly when she left for school. Harmless, friendly, the type of man people trusted without thinking. But the night of her disappearance, he claimed he didn't see anything and went to bed early. At first, that sounded suspicious. Until his time card at work proved he was on an overnight shift 30 miles away. The third was a driver reported by two witnesses, a man in a dark vehicle circling the block around the time Kimberly vanished. It felt promising. It felt like the lead that would break everything open. Police tracked down the vehicle. They questioned the owner, and the truth hit them like cold water. He was delivering newspapers on his usual route. 3 suspects, 3 collapses, 3 reminders that grabbing at shadows doesn't create answers. It creates exhaustion. By the end of the week, the investigation was bruised. It had hope, but no direction. Motion, but no progress. Noise, but no truth. Kimberly's parents watched officers come and go from their living room, coffee cups half finished, fatigue carved into their faces. With every suspect cleared, her mother's shoulders fell deeper, like the world was closing in on her. Her father paced the hallway, repeating the same line. Someone knows something. Someone has to. But no one stepped forward. No voice broke the silence. And the suspects who once looked promising turned into reminders of how far the truth still was. By the end of that week, one thing became painfully clear. The investigation wasn't just losing momentum. It was losing faith. As the first week slipped into the second, the energy around the case shifted, not because answers were coming, but because hope was thinning. At first, the neighborhood felt electric with urgency. People walked in groups, checked their sheds, searched under porches, and knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen Kimberly. But when every search ended exactly the same way, empty, something inside the community dimmed. Panic turned into exhaustion. Exhaustion turned into distance, and distance turned into silence. The flyers that once appeared on every mailbox began to curl at the corners. Coffee shops stopped talking about her. Even the families who promised to help every single day until she's found returned to their routines. It wasn't cruelty. It was the quiet retreat people make when fear becomes too heavy to look at directly. Her school held a small gathering in the cafeteria, a few speeches, a few candles, a moment of silence that barely lasted 30 seconds. By the next morning, lockers slamming drowned out everything, and the hallways went back to their usual noise as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't shared those same halls just days earlier. But inside the Thompson home, time didn't move at all. Kimberly's room stayed untouched. Her backpack still hung on the doorknob. Her unfinished homework sat open on her desk, neat handwriting trailing off mid-sentence. Her mother's voice grew softer each day, the kind of soft that comes when crying becomes a routine. Her father barely slept, sitting in the living room with the porch light on, waiting for a knock that never came. They stood outside during every shift change, watching patrol cars drive past without slowing down anymore. Detectives stopped visiting as frequently. They stopped updating unless the family called. And every time her mother walked into the station, the officers looked at her with the same tired expression, sympathy mixed with resignation. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was realizing the silence meant the world was slowly moving on without her. In those days, the investigation didn't just stall. It froze around the family like ice, trapping them in a moment they couldn't escape. By late winter, the investigation no longer felt like a search. It felt like a slow surrender. The detectives who once promised updates stopped giving timelines. Their calls turned into brief check-ins, then long gaps, then occasional messages that sounded more like apologies than progress. The Thompson family kept pushing, kept calling, kept asking the same questions, because doing nothing felt like betrayal. But every visit to the station ended the same way. A detective avoiding eye contact, a folder being quietly shut, and another reminder that we're doing everything we can. The words never changed, but the urgency behind them disappeared. Evidence that should have been handled with care was misplaced. A neighbor's statement was never followed up on. A delivery driver who claimed he saw a struggling girl near the tree line wasn't contacted again for 3 months. By then, he had moved out of state. The original officer who took the report retired the following year. His notes were stored in a box that no one opened again. Kimberly's mother wrote letters to newspapers, local stations, anyone who would listen. Only one responded. A tiny column at the bottom of page 6. No photo, no follow-up. Just a few sentences that did nothing but remind the family how quickly the world forgets. Her father kept driving the old search routes every weekend, long after volunteers stopped showing up. He memorized every ditch, every stretch of highway, every abandoned shed in a 20-mile radius. He drove until the gas tank emptied, then sat in silence before heading home to the same porch light that never turned off. By the time spring arrived, the case wasn't just stalled. It was considered unworkable. No leads, no suspects, no momentum, just a file shifted from an active shelf to the cold case drawer. And when the detective slid Kimberly's folder into that metal cabinet, it made a soft clicking sound. A sound her mother later said she felt in her bones, because that was the moment the city stopped looking. But the Thompson family never did. The search stopped, but the suffering didn't. The first year after Kimberly vanished felt like a storm with no end. Her mother, Linda, called the station every Monday asking the same question in different ways, hoping the answer would finally sound different. But every conversation ended with the same quiet tone, the same lines she had memorized. There are no new updates, ma'am. By 1976, the flyers had faded. The search routes grew over with weeds. The volunteers who once brought hot coffee and maps stopped showing up. Not because they didn't care, but because life pushed them forward in ways grief never pushed the Thompsons. People moved, others forgot. A few simply couldn't stand the weight of it anymore. Kimberly's father, Mark, refused to stop. Every week, he took the same drive along the old highway, slowing near the shoulder where her hair ribbon had been found. He never said it out loud, but Linda knew. He expected to see something he'd missed before. Something the police should have caught, but didn't. The city changed around them. New businesses replacing old ones. New faces filling old streets. But inside the Thompson home, time didn't move. Her room stayed untouched. Her birthday candles stayed boxed. Her mother kept a journal of every dream she had about Kimberly, even the ones that ended in tears. Because when a city stops searching, a family has to search even harder. By the early 1980s, Worcester tried to push the Thompson case into the shadows. People spoke about Kimberly the way they spoke about old weather, something that happened once, something they didn't want to feel again. New families moved in who never learned her name. Old neighbors who once joined search parties now lowered their voices when Linda walked by, not out of cruelty, but because guilt can turn even kind hearts quiet. Schools stopped mentioning her during assemblies. The local newspaper refused to revisit the story unless it was an anniversary year, and even then it was buried under ads and sports updates. A few reporters hinted the family needed closure, a word that felt like a slap to parents who woke up every day with the same question burning in their chest. By 1987, the police storage room changed buildings. Boxes moved. Files shuffled. Somewhere in the process, Kimberly's case slipped to the bottom of a metal shelf, out of sight, out of mind. Her evidence envelope, once handled with urgency, now sat untouched, gathering dust the way her memory gathered silence. But the Thompsons didn't forget. They couldn't. Grief becomes its own kind of responsibility, one only the grieving understand. Every birthday became a reminder of what Kimberly never got to grow into. Every holiday dinner left an empty chair that no one dared to move. Linda kept her daughter's room the same. Curtains washed, bed made, a small stuffed bear sitting upright on the pillow as if waiting to be hugged again. People said it wasn't healthy. They didn't understand. Keeping the room intact was the only way Linda could keep herself intact. Her husband, Mark, tried to be strong in the early years, but strength has an expiration date. The quiet destroyed him slowly. By the mid-90s, he spoke less, smiled less, aged faster than the calendar allowed. Some nights he sat on the porch with the porch light on, staring at the street, whispering the same words. "Come home if you can. Please come home." He said it long after hope stopped sounding logical. The kind of grief they lived with didn't shout. It drained people quietly, day after day. Friends drifted away, not because they stopped caring, but because they didn't know how to stand beside a pain that never softened. By 2001, the Thompson family wasn't living life. They were enduring it. By 2021, the Thompson case was little more than a fading label on a dusty archive shelf. Most of the detectives who once held the file were gone, retired, relocated, or buried. New recruits barely recognized the name. To them, Kimberly was just a cold case number, a problem from another era. But when Massachusetts formed a new cold case division that spring, every forgotten box from the basement was hauled into a conference room and stacked like a graveyard of unanswered questions. Detective Maria Salazar, newly transferred from Boston, was assigned 3 cases. 2 were straightforward. The third was Kimberly Thompson. She opened the file expecting a quick review, maybe a note recommending storage. Instead, she found a mother's handwritten letters clipped inside. Please written every year since 1980. The ink grew shakier over time, but the message never changed. Please don't let my daughter disappear twice. Maria felt something shift inside her. This wasn't a file. This was a family abandoned by time, so she made a decision that would change everything. She reopened the case that everyone else walked away from. Detective Salazar carried the evidence box to the forensic lab herself, refusing to let it sit one more hour in the basement where it had been forgotten for decades. The box was fragile, the tape brittle, the handwriting faded, but inside it were the last pieces of Kimberly's life. A torn fabric scrap, 2 long hair strands preserved in plastic, a fingernail scraping collected in haste by a rookie in 1980. Items that meant almost nothing back then, but in 20, they meant everything. Maria laid each item out carefully, as if she were handling something sacred. The lab technician, Dr. Elise Harmon, raised an eyebrow. "You think there's anything left to pull from these?" she asked. Maria didn't blink. "We're going to try." They began the process, cataloging, photographing, isolating microscopic particles that hadn't been touched in 40 years. Elise ran preliminary tests, expecting contamination or unusable degradation. But something surprising happened. The hair sample, ignored in the original investigation, contained enough preserved material for advanced sequencing. For the first time since 1980, the case wasn't silent. A spark of hope flickered, quiet but real. The sequencing machine hummed through the night, pulling fragments of truth from strands that had been untouched since the Carter administration. Detective Salazar tried to keep her hopes steady, but every hour felt heavier than the one before. She'd spent her career watching families age while cases sat still. She refused to let this be another one. By morning, Harmon called her back to the lab. Her voice was tight. "Maria, you need to see this." On the monitor, a digital profile slowly built itself, line by line, marker by marker. Not a full identity, not a direct match, but something just as powerful. A familial connection. The profile linked to a cluster of individuals living across Massachusetts, all tied to a single bloodline. A family name that had never appeared in the original reports. Not once. Maria felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs. "This can't be random." "It's not," Elise replied. "This is a legitimate connection. Somewhere in this family tree sits your suspect." 41 years of silence, broken by science in less than 12 hours. The past finally had a voice again. Cold, steady, undeniable. And it was pointing towards someone who had walked free for decades. Detective Maria Salazar printed the genealogy chart and spread it across the conference table. the pages overlapping like decades folding into each other. Names, dates, marriages, relocations, all leading back to one extended Massachusetts family that had lived quietly, worked ordinary jobs, and raised children who grew up believing their history was clean. But somewhere in that tree, someone had taken Emily Carter's life. Maria circled the branches with a red pen, isolating the closest genetic matches. 3 households, 7 individuals, all alive, all still living in the surrounding counties. None had ever been interviewed. None had ever been linked to the case. Her stomach tightened. "How did they miss this?" she whispered. Elise answered without looking up. "Because they didn't have what we have. You are the first detective with the tools to see the connections." The realization stung, not out of pride, but out of grief for all the years lost. Maria cross-referenced addresses with 1980 employment records, searching for anyone who could have been near the woods where Emily disappeared. When one name kept resurfacing, she stopped, pen frozen midair. A man who had lived less than 3 miles from the crime scene. A man who worked nights. A man with no alibi on record. For the first time in 41 years, the case no longer felt impossible. It felt close. Maria typed the name into the system with a heaviness in her chest, half expecting nothing, half bracing for everything. Gerald Whitmore, 64 years old now, former maintenance worker at a textile plant, lived in the same neighborhood Emily walked through the night she vanished. The database pulled up his old ID photo, grainy, faded, but unmistakably the same man who had once lived 3 streets away from the Carter family. Maria leaned closer. There was nothing alarming in his expression, just an ordinary face. A face that could blend into a grocery store line, a church pew, a school meeting, a face no one would remember unless they were forced to. She checked his file again. No criminal record, no arrests, nothing that tied him to any wrongdoing, which only made the match feel sharper. Elise looked over Maria's shoulder. "You think he's the one?" Maria didn't answer immediately. She studied his address history, the quiet decades, the clean paper trail. "I think," she said finally, "that his life looks a little too clean, because people who hide the longest often look the safest. And now, after 41 years, the first real shadow had stepped forward." The genealogy chart stretched across Maria's screen, a maze of names connected by dates, marriages, and generations of quiet lives. But one branch kept pulling her back. The Whitmore line. The DNA sample didn't give her a name. Not yet, but it pointed her toward a family with long Minnesota roots, men who had lived within walking distance of the Carter home in the late 70s. 2 brothers, Henry Whitmore, the older one, factory technician. Thomas Whitmore, the younger, truck driver, with frequent overnight shifts. Both alive, both still living in Minnesota, both with access, opportunity, and a history that fit far too smoothly. Maria stared at their old employment files, her pulse climbing. The chemical trace from Hannah's scarf, the one nobody in 1974 knew how to identify, matched residue used at Henry's workplace during that exact time period. Her breath caught. This wasn't coincidence. It was direction. For the first time in decades, the case wasn't drifting. It was pointing. Maria didn't waste a second. She requested discreet surveillance on both Whitmore brothers. Nothing aggressive yet, only quiet observation, the kind that reveals habits, routines, and blind spots. Thomas spent most of his days at home, rarely speaking to neighbors, moving with the stiffness of a man worn down by time. Henry, however, was different. He still walked to the corner store every morning, greeting familiar faces like the kindly grandfather everyone trusted. That was the part that made her chest tighten, the contrast between his warmth and the weight of the evidence leaning toward him. She reviewed the scarf fibers again, matching them to archived factory reports from 1974. The chemicals used in that department weren't available anywhere else in Duluth during that period. Only employees could have carried that trace. Only someone like Henry. But suspicion wasn't enough. She needed confirmation. Something current. Something that couldn't be dismissed. So when Henry tossed a used coffee cup into a public trash bin, Maria's team retrieved it within minutes. The cup was rushed to the lab. If the DNA matched the biological material from Hannah's scarf, 5 decades of silence would finally crack open. The lab called Maria earlier than expected, a tone in the technician's voice that made her pulse spike. She hurried into the analysis room, forcing herself to stay calm even as her mind raced ahead of the facts. On the monitor, two DNA profiles sat side by side. The technician didn't need a long explanation. One sentence was enough to shift the ground beneath her arm. It's a perfect match. The room felt smaller. For a long moment, Maria couldn't move. 5 decades of questions, doubt, and heartbreak had been reduced to 2 lines on a screen. 2 lines that finally carried a name strong enough to challenge half a century of silence. Henry Rowan, the man who smiled at neighbors, the man who repaired fences, shoveled driveways, and handed out candy at Halloween. The man who helped search for Hannah in 1974, walking shoulder to shoulder with her grieving family. Maria closed her eyes, not out of relief, not yet, but out of grief for the truth she now carried. This wasn't just evidence, it was an unmasking. Henry had lived among them for 50 years, and he had counted on time to hide what he left in the snow. Henry Rowan started his morning the same way he had for years: oatmeal, black coffee, and the quiet hum of his radio. He didn't rush, he didn't worry. He had spent half a lifetime believing the past had been buried deep enough to stay silent forever. At 7:12 a.m., that illusion shattered. Patrol cars surrounded his home, their lights bouncing off frost-covered windows. Neighbors peeked from porches, confused at first, then frozen by the sight of officers stepping out in full gear. The lead detective approached the front door with a warrant in hand and a lifetime's worth of truth behind it. Henry opened the door with a raised eyebrow, like he expected nothing more than a delivery. When he saw the badges, his face didn't twist or tremble. It simply went blank, as if he'd trained himself for this moment. "Henry Rowan," the detective said, "you're under arrest for the abduction and murder of Hannah Cooper." The old man didn't argue. He didn't deny. He just exhaled, a slow, resigned breath, like someone who finally realized that time had stopped protecting him. For the first time in 48 years, Duluth felt awake. Once Henry was in custody, detectives moved fast. The search warrant covered every inch of his workshop, a place locals had always walked past without a second thought. To most people, it was just an old shed behind a quiet man's home. But to the cold case unit, it was a crime scene preserved by arrogance and time. Inside, dust coated the shelves and tools hung neatly on hooks. Nothing gave away the truth at a glance. But behind a loose panel in the far corner, an officer found a small wooden box secured with rusted hinges. When they pried it open, the room changed. Hannah's pendant lay inside, the tiny silver charm her mother had given her on her 17th birthday. Next to it were Polaroid photos, edges yellowed with age, capturing moments Hannah never consented to, images no parent should ever have to see. A fragment of fabric matched the scarf she wore that night. The detectives fell silent, not because they were shocked, but because they finally had the proof Hannah had been fighting to leave behind. Outside, word spread quickly. What started as whispers grew into a wave of disbelief that swept through Duluth. Neighbors who once greeted Henry with friendly nods stood in their yards, stunned by the truth hiding in plain sight. News of the discovery moved through Duluth faster than any official statement ever could. By midday, clusters of neighbors gathered on sidewalks, whispering in voices that carried more fear than anger. These were people who had borrowed his tools, waved as he mowed his lawn, trusted him with their children's bike repairs. Now they stared at his house like it had always been a warning they failed to see. Some cried, some refused to believe it. Others said nothing at all, because how do you speak when the ground under your feet shifts? At the afternoon press conference, Detective Marquez stepped to the podium with a voice that almost cracked. She spoke with the weight of a woman who had carried Hannah's story for years, long before the DNA match, long before the evidence broke open. "This case has waited nearly 50 years, she said. Today, it finally has a voice." Behind her, Hannah's mother stood supported by community members. Her heartbreak was visible, but so was something else. The smallest spark of long-denied truth finally meeting daylight. Families of other missing girls began reaching out, sharing memories and suspicions they had buried for decades. The arrest didn't just shake Duluth, it unearthed the grief of an entire generation. As the sun began to set, Duluth felt heavier than it had in decades. Patrol cars still circled Rowan Street, their lights cutting through the gloom like reminders of everything the town ignored for too long. A few neighbors stood with their arms wrapped tightly around themselves, whispering the same question over and over. How did we not see it? The truth was painful. Rowan had been the kind of man people trusted without thinking. The quiet handyman, the friendly helper, the steady presence who blended into every corner of the neighborhood. And that familiarity had protected him more than any alibi could. Inside the station, Detective Marquez sat alone reviewing the evidence one last time. Every Polaroid, every scrap of fabric, every DNA printout. It wasn't relief she felt. It was a slow-burning ache for a life that should have been saved half a century earlier. She whispered not to the file, but to the memory of the girl she never met. We should have found you sooner. Across town, candles began appearing on porches, one by one, as if the entire community finally understood what Miriam had been carrying alone for so long. The arrest ended a mystery, but it reopened a wound Duluth had tried to forget. The press conference began just after 8 p.m., the room crowded with reporters, retired officers, neighbors, and people who had lived through the fear of 1974. Microphones crackled, cameras clicked, but when Detective Marquez stepped up to the podium, the noise fell into a tense, breathless stillness. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes carried every year Hannah had been missing. Today, she said, we confirm that the man taken into custody is responsible for the disappearance and death of Hannah Cooper. This case was never forgotten. It only needed the right tools and the courage to look again. Some reporters wiped their eyes, others stared in disbelief, but the reaction that hit the hardest came from the back row, a quiet gasp, followed by soft sobbing. Miriam's hands covered her face as decades of waiting finally cracked open into something raw, painful, and real. Marquez stepped down from the podium long enough to embrace her, giving the moment the humanity the case had always deserved. Outside, the wind swept across Duluth like a cold exhale. People stood on their steps, stunned, realizing the truth had lived beside them for 50 years. He grew old, but the crime never did. By January 2023, Duluth had learned to brace itself. After all the years of silence, after the arrest that shattered the illusion of safety, people walked into the courthouse with a mix of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. They'd grown old with this story. Now they wanted it to end properly. When Henry Rowan was brought into the courtroom, the room stiffened. He looked smaller than anyone remembered. A frail man with shaking hands and a blank stare, but no amount of age could soften what he had taken. Every person there understood it. Hannah's mother, Miriam, sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her daughter's initials. Detective Marquez stood behind her, steady, unblinking, protective, as if she were silently saying, "You're not alone today." The judge asked Rowan to rise. Instead of a confession, he entered an offered plea, acknowledging the evidence would crush him in trial while refusing to say the words that mattered. I did it. A murmur passed through the courtroom like a slow tear in the air. Some felt cheated. Others felt relieved it was one step closer to closure. But one thing was clear. This was the beginning of the reckoning Hannah had been owed for almost 50 years. The prosecution began by laying out what the town already knew. The DNA, the fibers, the photographs, the timeline no one could ignore anymore. But nothing struck harder than the testimonies that followed. Detective Lena Marquez took the stand first. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried every year Hannah had waited. She explained the science, the genealogy, the chain of evidence. Then she said the line that froze the entire room. Science remembers what people forget. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride. It was grief shaped into truth. Even Rowan lowered his eyes. Next came Miriam. For a moment, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath for her. She walked slowly to the stand, age written in her steps, yet something unbroken still lived in her expression. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but it didn't fail. She talked about Hannah's laugh, her art, her plans to study nursing. She talked about the porch light that burned for 49 years because she refused to give up. She talked about fear, loneliness, in the way hope becomes a burden when you carry it alone for too long. By the time she finished, half the room was wiping their eyes, and Rowan never looked up once. When Miriam stepped down, the defense tried to regain control of the room, but the weight of her words lingered. Rowan's attorney repeated the same tired points: age, frailty, a fading memory. But the jury wasn't looking at age. They were looking at a man who had walked free while a family lived in torment. Closing arguments were quiet, almost somber. The prosecution didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They simply held up Hannah's notebook, the one found near the bus stop, pages warped by ice and time, and said, "She didn't get a lifetime. He doesn't deserve one either." The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, Rowan's face didn't move, but the room shifted around him. The foreperson stood, hands steady. "We recommend life without parole." A single sob broke from somewhere in the gallery. It was unclear if it came from relief or exhaustion, possibly both. Rowan didn't speak a word, not when the sentence was read, not when he was escorted away, not when Miriam finally allowed herself to exhale for the first time in decades. For the first time since 1974, silence didn't feel cruel. It felt final. By the spring of 2024, Duluth began to feel different. For the first time in almost 50 years, people spoke Hannah's name without lowering their voices. Her story wasn't a rumor passed around at bus stops anymore. It wasn't a warning whispered to children. It had become something deeper, a reminder of what the town lost and what it refused to lose again. The lake walk, once a place her mother avoided, became the center of remembrance. A small memorial plaque was placed near the water with her photograph, the same soft smile she carried at 18. The community gathered there every March, not because they were asked, but because they finally understood the weight of what had been taken. Old neighbors brought flowers. Younger generations listened to the story for the first time. And Miriam, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, finally saw Duluth honor the daughter she had carried in her heart for half a century. No one rushed the moment. No one tried to soften it. They let her name linger in the cold air because it finally belonged to all of them. Months after the arrest, Duluth's community board approved something Miriam never expected to see in her lifetime: a scholarship created in Hannah's name. It was designed for young nursing students, the career Hannah once dreamed of before her life was stolen. The announcement alone brought quiet tears to people who had never even met her. Teachers shared her story with their classes. Students wrote essays about how they wanted to help others the way Hannah once planned to. Every year, the award went to someone who reminded the committee of her kindness, not loud or attention-seeking, but steady, gentle, and full of promise. When Miriam attended the first ceremony, she sat in the front row clutching Hannah's old scarf, the only thing she had left from that night. She watched a young woman step onto the stage, speaking about compassion, service, and the responsibility of caring for those who cannot care for themselves. For the first time in decades, Miriam didn't feel like she was standing alone in her grief. Hannah's dream hadn't ended. It had simply found new hands to continue it. Detective Lena Marquez never sought attention for reopening the case. She wasn't interested in praise, only truth. But the people of Minnesota didn't forget what she had done. Months after the trial, she was honored statewide for her persistence, a recognition that carried weight far beyond a plaque or a ceremony. Speakers talked about how she gave a voice back to someone who had been ignored for nearly half a century. They mentioned the long nights, the stubborn determination, the refusal to let cold files gather dust. Yet what moved the room most wasn't the applause. It was the moment Marquez stepped forward and said softly, "Justice is slow, but it does not disappear." Miriam was there too. She stood as the crowd rose to their feet, hands trembling, as she watched the woman who refused to let Hannah's story fade into silence. For the first time in years, Duluth felt united, not in fear, but in gratitude. The ceremony didn't erase the decades of pain, but it did something almost as important. It reminded the city that justice is possible, even when hope feels worn thin. For decades, Duluth avoided saying Hannah's name out loud. People whispered it in passing, glanced away from the corner where she vanished, and convinced themselves that forgetting was the same as healing. But after the arrest, something shifted. The silence that once wrapped around the city began to crack. At community forums, older residents stood up and admitted the guilt they carried, the guilt of moving on while Miriam kept her porch light burning. Younger people, who had only heard fragments of the story growing up, asked questions their parents had never been brave enough to answer. Schools invited speakers to talk about the case, and students wrote essays about the cost of looking away. The corner of Superior Street, once avoided, became a place where flowers began to appear each spring, not out of fear, but out of remembrance. For the first time since 1974, Duluth talked openly about what happened, not to relive the pain, but to make sure no one else endured what Hannah had. The silence didn't protect them. Speaking her name did. As the year came to an end, Duluth gathered at Lake Walk, the same path Hannah loved to sketch, the same view she never returned to. Lanterns lined the shoreline, glowing softly against the cold wind rolling in from Lake Superior. They flickered like hearts, still learning how to beat after years of holding their breath. Detective Marquez stood beside Miriam, watching families place candles along the stones. Children who hadn't even been born when Hannah vanished held the lantern ropes with care, as if helping the city carry a memory older than them. Students from the new scholarship program read her favorite poems. A small choir sang the lullaby Miriam used to hum while brushing Hannah's hair. Every sound, every breath felt like a promise that the light would never go out again. As the lanterns drifted across the water, the crowd fell silent, not from fear, but from respect. Duluth had lost a daughter in 1974. In 2024, it finally learned how to hold her. The camera pulls back over the lake, lanterns spreading across the dark water like a path leading her home. Final line: in a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice.